Good afternoon. My name is Mike Strands. I'm the Vice President of Advocacy for National Farmers Union, and welcome to today's webinar about important considerations for succession planning, the practical, the personal, and the ethical. We are joined today by three representatives from American Farmland Trust who will help us better think about and prepare for succession planning. This includes some perspectives on the dynamics around racial and gender disparities in land access and ownership, along with the changing demographics of the next generation. After all, to help family farms and ranches thrive and survive, it's important to plan for how best to transition the operation and ownership from one generation to the next. So we're looking forward to a robust discussion this afternoon and are glad that our presenters are able to spend some time with us. Before I get started, I just wanted to note a few housekeeping items of business. This webinar is one in the series of virtual programming events taking place in advance of our national convention. A schedule and recording of these virtual programming events can be found on our website. Now that you've registered for this webinar, you should be able to receive notifications for sessions on next Thursday afternoon and also on Friday, February 26th. Our panelists will be taking questions at the end of the presentation, so feel free to ask those questions using the Q&A box in your Zoom application. If you have any technical questions or issues, feel free to ask those in the chat box and an NFU member will gladly assist you. Feel free to let us know where you're joining us from too in that chat box. That's always fun to see. Again, this webinar is being recorded, so if you'd like to watch it again or share it with others, you'll be able to find a link on our convention webpage in the next day or two. So if you're unfamiliar with National Farmers Union, our mission is to advocate for family farmers and ranchers through education, legislation, and cooperation. We work to ensure that family farmers and their communities are respected, valued, and enjoy economic prosperity and social justice. So we encourage all attendees, if you're a member, if you're interested in becoming a member, if this is your first time taking part in one of our events, take a look at our website, www.nfu.org, and explore the opportunities to get involved. So with that, let's get started. I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin Joseph with American Farmland Trust. Caitlin.
Yes, thanks, Mike. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. And as Mike said, yes, we'll be taking some questions probably at the end of our presentation here, so feel free to submit those in the Q&A. And we'd love to just get a little information about each of you. So feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Just tell us a little bit about where you're from and if you have been getting started with your succession planning process, maybe a tiny bit about where you're at in that process or something you're looking to get out of this session. We'd love to hear from you. So again, my name is Caitlin Joseph, and I have two of my colleagues here from American Farmland Trust, and we'll introduce ourselves a little bit more in just a moment and in kind of our different roles and what we work on. But just as a bit of an overview of what we'll do today, I'm going to have us talk a little bit about kind of setting the stage for this conversation and like some of the context and in terms of how we can start to look at succession planning with an equity lens. So we'll talk a bit about the demographics and land access challenges that we're aware of and kind of how succession planning can play a role in that process. And then we'll have Jerry Cosgrove will jump in and provide a bit more information on some of the tools and approaches for actually navigating succession planning from the practical standpoint. He's a wealth of experience and information in that regard. And then we thought, learning by example is really the best way to kind of ground some of this content and help folks feel able to take that next step. So Susanna Dennison is going to share a bit about her own personal and professional story around succession planning and land access and kind of this intersection of asking these questions around approaching this topic with an equity lens. So we can move to the next slide, Mike. And just as some framing and information around AFT, American Farmland Trust, is a leading national conservation organization, and we're dedicated to really these three mission areas. So saving the land that sustains us by protecting farmland, promoting environmentally sound farming practices, and keeping farmers on the land. So we really do take a holistic view of agriculture and work at the intersection of farmers and environmentalism, trying to develop those practical solutions that can protect farmland and the environment. And our work really spans kind of the kitchen table to Congress lifespan, right? So tailoring solutions that we know are effective for farmers and communities, rooted in our research, programming, and policy advocacy work. We've been around since 1980 and have helped to permanently protect more than 6.5 million acres of farmland and ranch land, and led the way for the adoption of conservation practices on millions more. So again, really taking this holistic lens. And next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the initiatives that we undergo to achieve that mission. And these are just a few of them that are most relevant to this topic around succession planning and farmland transfer, land access. And we have representative from each of these areas within AFT. So I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves and talk a little bit about these initiatives. So Susanna, would you like to chime in here on Farms for a New Generation?
Hi, hello everyone. I am Susanna Dennison. I'm a program manager for the National Farms for a New Generation initiative at the American Farmland Trust. And I'm also today going to speak to you as a certified land access trainer and International Farm Transition Network Farm Succession Coordinator. That's a mouthful, but it's pretty indicative of the complicated nature of this topic. I'm a second generation diversified vegetable farmer, and will share more of my personal and professional succession story later on in today's presentation. But first, I want to talk briefly about two Farms for a New Generation programs at the American Farmland Trust that support one of the three sections of our mission statement, namely keeping farmers on the land. So the first one, I'm going to post two links in the chat next, but I'll talk to you first about Farmland for the Next Generation, which was a project, a land access project that was originally funded in 2015, where we partnered with national experts across the country to develop a comprehensive 8-part land access trainer curriculum. It was a skills-based or performance-based approach to this complicated topic, namely to really address what people need to do, not just what they need to know around accessing land. And then the second project that is currently underway, actually we received funding in 2020 to start kind of the part 2 of this work on land transfer from a beginner's perspective. Again, creating a skills-based or performance-based curriculum to primarily provide support from a beginner's perspective on land transfer. So those are two of several Farms for a New Generation projects and programs that we're currently working on.
Great, and Jerry, go ahead and chime
Sure.
in.
So my name's Jerry Cosgrove. I'm Farm Legacy Director here at American Farmland Trust. I'm also a senior advisor, as well as I'm of counsel with an agricultural law firm based in New York State, where I live. I've been working on these issues for a very long time. I've been at AFT 2 separate occasions. I worked for 15 years as a regional director in the Northeast. And for the last 5 years, I've been Farm Legacy Director with some time in government service, working for other nonprofits in between. I'm a licensed attorney. Hopefully folks won't hold that against me. And I've been practicing law, working on farm transfer and farm conservation issues for over 30 years. So I've earned my senior status. Farm legacy and land protection are really intertwined at AFT. Farm legacy is a program for AFT's members and other landowners, where essentially we help folks figure out what to do with their land and how to transfer it. Some folks have the next generation in line, many don't. And so that can pose different sets of issues and concerns for them. The bottom line is to help landowners achieve their legacy with their land, their farm or ranch. And it's really an important issue because there's a demographic tidal wave coming, land transfer over the next 10 to 20 years. And we do it by working with landowners and their advisors. I also work within AFT with my colleagues in the New Generation program, Women for the Land. And we have a land protection transaction team that I work closely with when it comes to implementing farmland protection projects as well. So happy to be here today and look forward to the discussion later on.
Yes, and Jerry mentioned our Women for the Land program. So my role is really with this initiative as part of our national work that really kind of cross-cuts all of AFT's mission areas with a focus on women in agriculture. And, you know, so increasingly we've been diving into this topic of succession planning and land access through our peer-to-peer learning circles with women, landowners and farmers, and increasingly aspiring farmers as well. So we've been really excited to be learning from our colleagues and partners around the country about these issues and kind of how we can be really leveraging women in agriculture around these topics. So we can move on to the next slide. Yeah, and as Jerry mentioned, we know that there's really some demographic shifts, you know, afoot that we're really already experiencing, right? So we know there's these dual challenges when we think about farmland transfer and farmland access. So nationally, we know from US agriculture census data that the stakes are really high when we think about farmland transfer. Primary producers age 65 and older outnumber those by under the age of 35 by more than 6 times. So these seniors really own a large share of American farmland. What we see is more than 40% at this point. So despite the large share of farms that are poised to face this generational transition, USDA estimated that only 10% of agricultural lands would change hands between 2015 and 2019, and only 2% of those transfers would go to a non-family member. At the same time, access to land is a pervasive challenge for young and beginning farmers and ranchers, and it's especially difficult for beginners to acquire affordable land with appropriate housing and infrastructure due to farm consolidation, appreciation of land values, conversion of farmland to development, and a tight supply of land to purchase or rent. So despite these challenges, we've seen though that most farmland acquired by beginning farmers actually occurs through a non-relative transfer. So whether or not the new generation producers will inherit land or acquire it through other means, they need knowledge and skills to negotiate with family members and or non-relatives to achieve secure land tenure and to keep our agricultural lands in production. So we really see this as a multi-directional issue. Farmland transfer is often an emotionally charged process that has high stakes for both family relationships, personal finances, and even community level implications. And I know some of y'all who've introduced yourselves in the chat sounds like can resonate with that experience. So we can move to the next slide here. At the same time, we know that the next generation of farmers that's coming up is generally more diverse. So, you know, we've seen that, you know, compared to prior generations, this diversity is growing just in terms of our nation's demographics. So more than agricultural landowners, who currently more than 98% of whom are white, and about 95% of producers, so the folks who are kind of making decisions in terms of land management, also identify as white. So African American, Asian American, Black, Native American, Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, Hispanic farmers are also more likely to be tenants and own less land than their white counterparts. At the same time, women who are in the kind of non-operating landowner category are really increasingly important in the land transfer conversation. AFT's Women for Land program has done a lot of research on this particular contingent, And we've seen that institutional landowners often have available farmland but don't know how to find or negotiate suitable arrangements with qualified new gen producers. And the women non-operating landowners that are kind of part of this contingent tend to be sort of increasingly isolated from the information and networks that they need to help them get started with this transfer conversation. So we know that the demographics are a really important component to be considering. We can move to the next slide. And honing in on women in particular, we've seen that this demographic is kind of on the rise in agriculture in a number of different ways. So we know that as of 2017, about 40% of US agricultural land was farmed or co-farmed by women, and 37% of total rented land in the US is owned by women non-operating landowners that I mentioned. So, really over the last 3 decades, women have been entering agriculture in unprecedented numbers, though we know there's issues with kind of how the data tracks and surfaces women's presence in agriculture. So increasingly, this is an important contingent to be considering as one of the allies we have in farmland protection and farmland access. Next slide. And just, another piece on the women non-operating landowners. We know that non-operating landowners in general are facing succession challenges, but our research has shown that the women in particular in this situation are at a higher rate, don't really know who the next owner of their land will be. So there's a particular interest that we have in reaching this contingent of non-operating landowners. We also are aware from kind of our survey research and anecdotal evidence that we hear from our participants at our learning circles that women often at least perceive, if not in practice, have less power in decision making on their land, even when they own it outright due to historic ties with male farmer tenants or previous relationships that they did not necessarily hold, but have come into that position of ownership. So a lot of nuances that these women are navigating. So I'll turn it over to Jerry now to talk a little bit about kind of as we're approaching succession planning, what are some of the tools at our disposal and steps that you can start to take.
Thanks, Caitlin. Mike, if you could shift to the next slide. So what I'm going to do for the next 25 or 30 minutes is to provide an overview of succession planning, farm transfer, estate planning. There's lots of names that we put on the process. I'm not going to go into too much detail in any one area. And as was stated before, we'll encourage folks, if you have some more specific questions, please enter them into the Q&A. We'll try to get to those in the Q&A session. I'm sure my contact information will be available, and I'm happy to answer queries via email as well, particularly ones that might be either more detailed or more sensitive than you might want to share to the entire group. I'll probably spend a little bit of extra time on one tool in particular, the agricultural conservation easement. Again, I've spent a career really working at the intersection between farm transfer and farmland protection. And we'll talk about how agricultural conservation easements can be a useful tool in particular, though there are many tools in the toolbox. In terms of a succession plan, the first thing I want to say to folks is these aren't easy. So you shouldn't feel ashamed of the fact that you're having trouble getting started or you're having trouble seeing it through. These are important issues, family relationships, financial, often with a lot of emotional attachment, family relationships spanning back decades. So I would say to folks that you've got to be patient and hang in there and recognize that it's a process. But I think the two most important things that I would hope folks carry away is one, you've got to get started. So there's no time like the present to start the process. And then two, you have to stay with it. Even if you get distracted, things become difficult because if the follow through isn't there, whatever planning steps you put into place may not have their desired impact. Again, there's a wide range of issues that are addressed in a succession plan. If for active farm operations, often it's the continuation of the business or perhaps, sort of change of the business. There's again, a farm business involved. The strategy for transferring management as well as ownership of the business is critical. For landowners, whether they have a farm operation or non-operating landowners, very often we find that the legacy of the land, the future use of the land, keeping it in agriculture, available for agricultural use, is one of the most important elements of the succession plan. And often, in my view, probably isn't given the attention that it deserves. And then there's a variety of the mechanics, legal agreements, financial arrangements. I'll touch on those to transfer the business assets, the operating assets, the real estate, and the land. So again, I'm going to try not to get too far in the weeds today, but certainly if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. We'll try to get to as many as we can. And I'm sure there'll be contact information so you can follow up. Next slide, please, Mike. So you got to start someplace. And one of the areas, and I'll spend a little bit more time on this in another slide, that I feel is very important and often is neglected is discussing values and setting goals. I believe very strongly that to have a successful farm transfer, farm succession process, folks in the process really need to put their values on the table and set the goals to attempt to achieve those values. Now, that's not always feasible in every case, but it's certainly important to make sure that they're on the table up front. And again, I find a lot of times folks will want to run right into the mechanics and not take that step back at the start of the process to really think about, well, what do we want the end result to be? And how is that going to reflect our values and in many cases, generational values? Then you've got to sit down and identify the issues, more into the nuts and bolts. There are three basic issues that I encourage folks to really think about. One is if there's an active business, dealing with the transfer of management. It's not just about the ownership, it's about who's going to run the farm business. Are they ready to do it? Are the folks in the pipeline going to be prepared to take over? Secondly, there is the actual transfer of the assets. Again, I usually separate them into the operating assets and the real estate. Operating assets, again, more directly linked with the business operation, probably easier in most cases to transfer. And usually I encourage folks to think about transferring operating assets as part of a gradual process and leaving the real estate to be dealt with later on. Though I would also caution that many times folks leave the real estate too long, and we can come back to that later on. And then thirdly, and very importantly, financial security and peace of mind. And it's very important to remember that this is a two-way street. The senior generation has the need and expectation for a secure retirement, asset protection, thinking about how to cover medical costs, healthcare costs. But the next generation also has an important value and need to be assured that they're going to be treated fairly in the process. The cards will be on the table. And they'll have a sort of input into how things proceed, recognizing that it's really got to be a dialogue. Again, a mechanical step that's important, inventorying the assets. What are they? Who owns them? What are the values? Again, getting these issues on the table up front and not leaving them for later can solve or identify or surface some issues early on. Building the team. I can't emphasize enough that it really takes a team to accomplish a farm succession plan and enable the transfer from one generation to the next. Again, you're going to need legal help, but the reality is most lawyers are mechanics. They will implement your goals and try to implement your values but they can't make those decisions for you. So oftentimes stepping back in the process, utilizing folks with the expertise like Susanna has to come in and really help think through some of these more difficult, what lawyers call the quote, soft issues, or deal with communications issues upfront is really critical. So that's an important, again, you need your tax and financial advisor, probably a farm business advisor. And in most cases, you're probably going to want to have your lender at the table, the not so silent partner in most farm operations. In some cases, it may be necessary or helpful to get some mediation help. There are a number of ag mediation programs across the country in each state. There are also in some areas of the country sort of, and AFT has been working on this, creating a network of what we call farm navigators, folks who are not necessarily trained in all the details of the process, but who understand a lot of the issues and can help facilitate discussion, dialogue, and more effective communication. And again, I think particularly if there's land protection, an interest in land protection, having a nonprofit or a farmland protection entity involved can be very helpful too. Again, American Farmland Trust has played this role for since our inception. There are many local agricultural land trusts, regional land trusts, a number of state and local farmland protection programs, other nonprofit organizations such as California Farm Link that again work on this process. In my home state of New York, we have a very well established New York FarmNet, and in New England, there's a very able nonprofit Land for Good. So a wide range of resources out there to help think through all the various components of a farmland protection, farm transfer, and potentially farmland protection tools. Let me just jump to the next slide, please, Mike. So I just want to spend a minute before I go through the tools, give an overview of the tools, about a very good slide, which I have borrowed from the Women for the Land learning circles. I have had the honor of participating in several of the learning circles discussing farm transfer. And one of the most valuable sessions that they would have in these relatively small discussion groups, usually 10 to 12 folks, was a values discussion. This one is focused on land values, but I can't tell you how helpful it was for me in preparation for a discussion of the tools to get a better sense of all the participants' values. And frankly, it was very revealing for them to think through all of those values, all of the various factors that can and will come into play in terms of putting together a farm succession plan and thinking about the future of the land. So I won't belabor the values, but they're very important to think about. There's a wide variety of them. There's no right or wrong answer when it comes to the values. But again, as I said at the outset, I can't emphasize enough that it's really important that the family, both sides of the equation, think through, discuss, and hopefully reach consensus on the priorities in terms of values. Next slide, Mike. So I'm going to spend a moment here with sort of the broad brush overview, probably something akin to a fire hose in terms of the tools. Try to give you a sort of a brief outline of the tools, how they can be used, and then after I go through the list, I'll come back to conservation easements and spend a little bit more time on those, since for some of you folks, they may not be as familiar in terms of a tool. So again, starting with the basics, the business structure. Again, I think many farm operations historically were sole proprietorships. As you add more partners, members, it's critical that the business structure evolve to recognize that. Again, right now, currently, the business structure of choice is a limited liability company, creates a lot of flexibility, taxed as a partnership, but treated has liability protection like a corporation. The operating agreements, most states have a fairly basic set of requirements. So there's a lot of flexibility in how you structure both the ownership, the management, and the decision-making within an LLC. The other thing that I would encourage folks to think about as the business grows and expands is to think about creating more than one LLC, perhaps multiple LLCs for different enterprises. If there's a cropping operation or a livestock operation, or maybe some direct marketing operation on the farm, it may make sense to separate those into separate LLCs and create more akin to arm's length relationships between them. In addition, I think it can be very helpful to separate the land into its own LLC or ownership. Again, land is probably makes more sense to transfer as a separate asset later in the transfer process. And by creating separate entities, create some opportunities for the next generation to get more involved in the business, where the senior generation can retain ownership and control of the land base, which may be important from a financial and operational security perspective. In each case, a key component of any business operating agreement is a buy-sell agreement. Because again, one of the keys in any beginning relationship is to think about, well, how do we unwind it? What happens if it falls apart? If something happens, if somebody gets disabled, dies, withdraws from the operation, divorced, there's all sorts of things that can happen that will mean that the business structure will need to change. And so thinking through what that's going to look like, how the assets are going to be valued, is there going to be financing? What are the payment terms? All of these things really need to be put in place in advance, so that while you're probably not going to foresee every contingency, it's important to think them through as thoroughly as possible. And the same is true, I think, with land. One of the challenges that I see is that too often the land transfer is put off and put off and put off with the expectation that it will be transferred at death. And that can create its own issues because many times when the land is transferred at death, it's transferred equally to all of the children, whether or not all of the children are actively involved and engaged in the farming operation. And that arrangement always raises what planners consider the fair versus equal conundrum. That's what, fair is not equal and vice versa, particularly when it comes to the land, which is, I think, an asset that really needs to be thought about differently than some of the other assets, because it's probably the most valuable asset in any estate, in any farm business, and also the most difficult to divide, and can be impossible to divide fairly if it's got a significant value that exceeds the farming generation's ability to finance it or capitalize it over time. A variation on sort of the land arrangement can be a long-term lease. Again, this can be facilitated if you've got separate structures. So a business, the LLC operating business, can lease the land perhaps for a long term from the land ownership entity, quite often a separate LLC, usually owned by the senior generation, but not always. Again, can be a very useful tool. Gifts, I think, are probably an underappreciated transfer tool, but the reality is that if you really look at most farm family transfers, almost all of them involve a significant level of gifting. There are some instances where it's fair market value transaction all the way around, business assets as well as the land assets. But I would hazard to say that in the vast majority of these situations, there is usually a significant gifting element. And one of the things I think that's a challenge outside of family transfers is that the gifting element is often not on the table in a non-family transfer. And this can create, I think, a significant financial differential and financial hurdle for someone who's not related to the folks on the farm. And I've had the conversation with some landowners that if they've got what they would consider a deserving farmer that they may want to sell the land to, there's nothing wrong with considering a gift to a non-family member. There's no I don't see any There's certainly no financial requirement that gifts be limited to family members. And I think from a transfer perspective, it's probably a tool that needs more consideration in non-family transfers. Life insurance, again, it's critical to have what the insurance salespeople hate to call death insurance. But, particularly if there's a key member, sort of a financial obligation, probably the best way to ensure that funds will be available if something terrible happens to somebody in the farm business. Life insurance is a good tool. I don't have the financial expertise to really compare term insurance with the whole life insurance policies that actually build cash value. But suffice to say that I think life insurance is a key component, quite often can be taken out on a key person or maybe in anticipation of a key expense, say distributing the land upon the death of the parents to the farming child, with life insurance proceeds being allocated to the non-farming children as a way to create a greater level of fairness, by being creative about making things more equal. Trusts are a very common approach, again, particularly in terms of looking for asset protection. So many farm operations will place some of the property value in trusts. What I would say with trusts is the key here is to make sure that they're properly set up and maintained. So the two keys, I think, are that the trustee have sufficient discretion and knowledge to manage farm assets if that's what they're being expected to do. So you can't really expect a bank trust officer necessarily to have the knowledge to make decisions in terms of farm operations. And the other key is to be very clear about who the beneficiaries are and how their decision-making is going to impact the ultimate disposition of the trust assets. And like anything, the trusts need to be revisited, maintained, and assets, if they're to be protected, need to actually be transferred to the trust and retitled. And of course, wills are a very basic farm transfer document. Some practitioners try to get all of the assets into trust so you can avoid wills and the subsequent probate, which is the legal process to implement the will. But I think as sort of a practical matter, it's important to have a will, and important to recognize that the executor of the will be bound by the actual terms of the will. So if you have instructions in terms of disposition of property, you better make sure that those instructions are in the will, because the executor can't rely on the conversation that you had with them, telling them what you really want done, unless it's actually in the actual text and reflected in the language of the will itself. So that's a range of the tools. I'm going to spend a couple more minutes. Next slide, please, Mike. On the agricultural conservation easement. Again, by way of basic background, it's a permanent deed restriction, restricts non-agricultural use, encourages and promotes agricultural use. You can sell them. There are state purchase programs, local purchase programs across the country. That's an area where AFT has done a lot of work over the last 40 years. They're not as widespread as we'd like, but it's certainly an option. There are also significant income tax deductions for donated conservation easements. They're particularly generous for easements on agricultural land that stays in agricultural use. But it's recognizing that in many cases, the financial sacrifice reflected in a donated conservation easement is not necessarily feasible. That said, I would encourage folks to think about conservation easements generally as an insurance policy for the land. They're a deed restriction that essentially prevents the future generation or generations from doing something detrimental to its continued use in agriculture. And again, from an organization that has as one of its core mission tenets is farmland protection, we think it's a very useful and important tool, both in terms of the farm transfer process, but also importantly, keeping that land available for future agricultural use. Sometimes folks don't really think about the fact that you can incorporate a conservation easement into your will or into your trust document. Many are actually done during one's lifetime, but they can certainly be incorporated in a document that's going to come into effect at your death. Again, a different way to effectuate the interest puts it off, but one of the advantages is that it does put it off, so folks could change their mind, but it's also important to have very explicit instructions in the will itself so that you can have your wishes effectuated after your death. And importantly, it's important to remember that these are third-party restrictions that can only be enforced by a nonprofit or municipality. You can't give a conservation easement to your neighbor and expect your neighbor to enforce the terms necessarily of the conservation easement. Every state has a specific enabling statute that provides for third-party enforcement by a conservation nonprofit, such as American Farmland Trust or an agricultural land trust, or a municipal entity, could be local, county-based, regional, or the US government. Next slide, Mike. So one of the things I learned a long time ago, it was an aha moment at a seminar that I was doing when I was just starting to practice law, is that conservation easements can really help facilitate farm succession. It was an observation made by a farmer. I was giving a presentation on conservation easements and how they could be used by farmers. And a farmer came up afterwards and said to me, this is a big decision. Don't you think this really should be, thought about in the context of an overall farm transfer plan? It was one of these light bulbs going off for a young lawyer, because he was exactly right. And I think that I really see farmland protection and farm transfer going hand in hand, important to think about to the extent possible in an integrated fashion, because they really work together in terms of making long-term decisions, both for a farm business and in context of an estate plan, but also for the land. And again, easements can help farm succession by keeping land available for agricultural use, whether it's for someone in your family or someone from outside the family. Keeps that land available from being subdivided, chopped up, converted into non-agricultural use. If you're selling a conservation easement, they're can be very important in generating income to invest in the ag business and or support retirement. Again, folks who own farmland say, rightly so, that their land is their retirement. Farmers are notorious for plowing back all of the income from their farm businesses back into their farm businesses, either by improving the real estate, buying more real estate, and quite often it creates what we would call a liquidity bind upon a generational transfer, because the value is perhaps heavily weighted in the ag business and in the land. So to the extent there's a purchase of easement program, that some of that equity can be converted without having to divest the land, without having to sell it to a developer. And those funds can be used for a variety of purposes and can really help facilitate the transfer from one generation to the next. In addition, some of the proceeds could be used to satisfy a non-farmer heir in terms of a legacy. And then importantly, in terms of land access, is easements reduce the market value of the property. It ranges widely depending on how much development pressure is in your area or region. But the fact is that the restriction to agricultural use means that on the open market, which sadly values non-farm development at a higher value in terms of dollars than agriculture, it will reduce that value, thus making it more affordable for a farm operator who doesn't need the non-farm value, but really is looking for the value to help farm the land. And I think that's what I have. Again, I'll be happy to answer questions in the Q&A. I'll take a look at those and when we circle back, but I guess now I'll turn it over to you, Caitlin. All right.
Yes. Yeah, and I saw some great questions coming in both in the chat and in the Q&A. So we'll get to those in just a few minutes. Just wanted to spend a little bit more time here. And Mike, we'll still use the slides if you're able to keep those up. We just wanted to share a couple of examples of kind of what this can look like in practice. I know Jerry just shared a lot of amazing information about kind of the nitty gritty tools that you can use. So wanted to kind of provide a bit of time here to help this come to life, help these tools kind of coalesce in terms of how this works in the real world context. So in the interest of that, I just wanted to share a narrative snapshot from one example of a farmland transfer scenario that involved several of the elements that we've touched on so far. So this is a picture and the story link down at the bottom to a story of Red Dog Farm, which comes from Rogue Farm Corps in the Pacific Northwest. They're a nonprofit there that does these amazing Changing Hands workshop series, really focused on this transfer of land from landowners to aspiring farmers looking for secure land tenure. So highly recommend their series of narratives if you're interested in digging into a few more of these examples. Since, as Jerry mentioned, there's many different ways this process can go, and that can be helpful in kind of imagining what possibilities there are for your farm. So just diving in here, the story of Red Dog Farm really centers around Karen Williams, who leased her land for many years to get started. So she really built a community of, the local community customer base, and kind of got her feet under her, got her business plan all set up. And when she realized she wanted to have more secure land tenure, she struck up a relationship with the Jefferson Land Trust as a partner. So that was a locally based land trust in her local area. They work at kind of a county level. So, Jerry mentioned that AFT is a national nonprofit and we're a land trust. So there's land trust partners all around the country, and we'll talk a little bit towards the end about some resources you can explore on our website as to land trusts that might be in your area. So this is just one way that Karen Williams got started with her process. So she had her eye on 23 acres of a former dairy that was for sale by an elderly widow in her area. And it was prime farmland, but it also was sort of a blank slate for what she wanted to do. So it would take a lot of money just to build up the farm operations for what she envisioned. And the land trust was able to provide a bridge for Red Dog Farm in that process. So they purchased the farm with a loan from Craft 3, which was a nonprofit lending institution. So lots of, in terms of the building the team portion that Jerry mentioned, this is one that you might not have thought of as, where are those lending institutions that have these creative models that might be more available for folks pursuing these creative models. So after they got the funding from Craft 3, they started leasing to Williams with the intent that they would put a conservation easement on the farm, which, as Jerry mentioned, would permanently preserve the land and reduce the cost of the land for Karen as she was entering. So Williams was able to purchase, or she would be able to purchase the land within 5 years, is kind of how they set up the plan. So they set that up through a lease agreement that was called a ground lease agreement, which allowed the farmer to put infrastructure like irrigation on the land. And if she wanted to walk away from the land, she could get the value of that investment out. So that was an important piece of the structure for her. And she built up 3 years of good credit that she needed to secure a low interest loan through the Farm Service Agency, through USDA's Beginning Farmer Loan Program. And she actually ended up being able to purchase the land ahead of schedule, ahead of that 5-year period that they had built in. So during that leasing period, she and the land trust were able to figure out a conservation easement that worked for the farm operations that she wanted to run, and allowed them to preserve and restore critical salmon habitat along the river near the farm. So since then, she's really built Red Dog Farm into a steady year-round business with 14 full-time and 2 part-time employees. And just in this past year, the farm was looking to expand, potentially through a new lease through the land trust, as part of a mixed-use development that they were looking to ultimately provide, kind of a next crucial piece of their thriving local agricultural economy, which was affordable housing for farm workers. So really kind of thinking holistically about, this process of transfer from the retiring generation. And as Jerry mentioned, the role of that agricultural conservation easement, both in terms of protecting the land and agriculture, making it more affordable for the next generation, but also doing that in a process with the successive generation, the entering generation, allowed the writing of that to be really conducive to the new vision that Karen had. So hopefully this example at least sparks some ideas and inspiration for you, and definitely recommend digging on the internet for more of these examples. There's lots of different versions of this and ways it can go. And of course, as Jerry mentioned earlier on as well, this is a process, right? Like most folks aren't going to wrap this up in a tidy bow in a number of years. There's an unfolding that occurs. So we can move to the next slide, and then we'll share another example. So just to kind of wrap up this portion and ground some of this information for you all, just wanted to suggest a few questions that you can be asking yourselves as you approach this process with this equity lens. So just thinking about, how you could be doing things differently with an eye towards gender and racial equity, both within your family or outside of your family. So thinking about, the folks in your community, is there an aspiring farmer in your community who might be looking for land or a business? And is there an opportunity to strike up a relationship? Is there an organization in your area that's dedicated to the values that you share that could help you with this plan? So, as you move through that process of kind of articulating your long-term values of what you want your land or your business to impact in the world, is there a way that you can be sure that as you're building your team, those relationships are set up for success in terms of materializing those values? And then again, who might you build into your succession team to help you navigate some of these questions, right? So there's probably a wealth of information out there, but definitely can be tricky to be asking these questions in consideration of, the history of land policy in the US, right? So thinking of, are there creative partners that you can be building in that can help you grapple with those issues? And then how might you think differently about your land and its legacy? So knowing that, farmers tend to get pretty into the weeds, right? With how is this land perpetuating my business, and how can I make sure that it's viable in the long term? But of course, there's a host of other things that your land fulfills, both for you and your community and the broader community outside. So just wanted to offer a couple of these examples of things that you can be thinking about as you approach or take the next step in your process. So Mike, we can move to the next slide. I'm actually going to turn it over to Susanna to very generously share a bit more of a story case study from her own life.
Thanks, Caitlin. Hi again, I'm Susanna, and I am going to tell you a story now for the next 10 minutes or so. This is me and my dad and another farm worker harvesting carrots, I believe a couple Novembers ago. And so today I'm going to give you firsthand kind of more of a case study or story of working and continuing to work on our family succession planning. I want to cover 3 topics generally today, namely the conservation planning, the gender and family dynamics, as well as the farm labor / management. Those 3 topics have been integral in our succession planning. So I'm here to give you an example. But firstly, I just want to echo what Jerry had said previously, that conservation easements can actually support succession planning happening going forward, primarily since both processes can ask the same or very, very similar questions. And now that I'm reflecting on that, I can really see this in my own family story as well. And secondly, I also want to speak to the potential importance, role, and impact of the junior generation like myself in successful succession planning. What's coming to my mind is, namely, I can hear my mom saying, "We started this," meaning the succession plan, "because of you and Maggie, Susanna. We were thinking of your future, not ours." So keeping in mind the questions that Caitlin just posed in the previous slide, because I am going to interweave those as well. But I do want to start things off with the question that we all, as a family, and also as now a farm succession coordinator myself, or facilitator for other farm and ranch transfers, I want to pose this question to you all, namely to ask yourself, if you are beginning or in the middle, I don't really know if there's an end point for succession planning. It seems like a never-ending and ongoing process. But I want to ask you directly, what are you transferring? Are you transferring a farm or ranch business, or the farm or ranch land, or both? And this is where I see the term legacy pop up, and I can see it both legacy in terms of the business and the land, or both. So I think, going back to what Jerry said, like, first and foremost, you got to know your priorities, your values, the goals. This is the way that my family has been assessing those priorities, namely, what are you transferring and why? All right. So first topic is the conservation easement process. So I want to jump off the information Jerry presented in the agricultural conservation easement slide before, namely connecting conservation easements with farm and ranch succession, because it's all of those bullet points pertain to my family's farm. Namely, we are conserving land for agriculture in perpetuity. Secondly, we're generating income to invest in the ag business and or support retirement. And then lastly, which is less the case for my family's farm specifically, but I see this across the country, easements can significantly help make land more affordable for the current and future farm operators. So my family decided right around the recession, I believe, to start pursuing the conservation easement process. And again, maybe this is another reason conservation easements and succession planning work so well together, because they are a process, and they are a multi-year process, and they make you practice patience. These are all very good life skills. So the primary goal for my family was to slow the increasing development near our farm in the Capital District of New York City. However, so that was the primary goal. However, what I have loved to see the most is the encouragement and expansion of the wildlife on our farm since the easement was placed on the farm. But I also want to say, probably combined with ever increasing certified organic production practices as well. But I guess it's, rather than just, I like to think of conservation as not just fixing or freezing conservation, but or freezing the land as is, but allowing it to not return to what it was before, but to allow it to grow and expand and flourish in ways that it might not have been able to do so before. And lastly, I will touch on the affordability factor, because yes, you are removing the development rights of your land ownership rights package when you create a conservation easement. So this can undoubtedly make the land more affordable to the current and future operators on that land. Corresponding with that is, however, I do want to, it depends on who is that third party holding the easement. In our case, it was an area ag land trust, which then became another kind of conservation and land management resource that we continue to tap into. So you're not just placing a conservation easement on, you're actually creating more relationships with neighbor area farmers that also are interested in conservation. And then what are the other grant or financial and other just resources and accessibility that the land trust might know that you might not know. And so that relationship has become very important as well. So the second topic I want to touch on today is the inevitable gender and family dynamics in our succession planning. Namely, it's two sisters, myself and my sister Maggie, one who has primarily been off farm in her adult life, me, and one who's primarily been on farm, my sister, managing the farm. And so I do want to bring back in that important and difficult topic of fair versus equal. Namely, who is contributing to the farm business actively? That's the fair, versus equal. Who should what does inheritance mean to you in your succession plan? Is it equal among the offspring, namely if they're not all on or off farm? And so there's a bunch of information that you can learn more about fair versus equal, but I want to present it to you because you gotta assess it for yourself and your family and farm dynamics. What will fair versus equal look in your farm or ranch specifically? So I also, in these family and more gender dynamics, I want to highlight the necessity of holding space, or really just planning for the inevitable emotions that come up with succession planning. This speaks to Jerry's previous slide, getting started with the process, in particular, the identify the issues bullet point. And namely, in short, if whatever elephant isn't already in the room, it will get there. So it's better to address the hard stuff up front. And so I'll leave it there. If you want to advance to slide 1, I'd love to talk about the third aspect of what I wanted to bring in our story today, namely the current farm, labor, and management. These are 2 men that I would call my family. They're non-family family. Tyrone's on the left and Walter's on the right. And this is a way to address heir versus non-heir farm or ranch transfer that's kind of playing out in my own family story. Namely, it's been important to ask, who are the people, family or non-family, that are coming to the quote-unquote succession table? So again, pictured here are 2 H2A workers, Walter and Tyrone, who have worked on the farm more than either heir, namely my sister and I, in part just because of our own life choices and also just their age, they're older than us. And like I said, are very much considered non-family family. But does the law know that? Does the legal system know that? No, it does not. So this dynamic is tricky in succession planning. Namely, legally, this dynamic of non-family family does not answer if or what long-term farm workers are inheriting during succession planning. So I want to pose that to you because this is actually another example of fair versus equal, namely outside the family. And if this is a situation that is somewhat familiar to something you might face, especially if you don't have an identified heir successor, I would suggest starting to answer the following for your operation. Namely, how are the farm or ranch workers' roles and aspirations a part of your succession planning process? So those are the three topics I want to cover, and it looks like we've got a little more than 10 minutes left. So I think we've got plenty of good questions. So I want to leave my story there, and thank you for listening. And I'm going to hand it back over to Caitlin now, so you can kind of address what questions in the short amount of time we have left we might get to.
Yeah, sounds good. And Mike, I think we can take the slides down while we have the rest of the conversation. So Jerry, I don't know if you looked through the Q&A and saw any that you really wanted to answer, but I've definitely been logging some questions. I guess just before we dive back into nitty gritty, while we kind of have the momentum that you just discussed, we did get a question about kind of the resources around fair versus equal. So if you have thoughts on kind of links to resources that we can provide, or if you want to speak a little bit more to that, kind of how you all have navigated that, what you've referenced in that process, folks are interested in that.
Great, I'm glad there's interest, because it's not easy. It's, is there, it's some people are worried that it's favoritism, others are just don't even know how to dive into it. I'm gonna, after I stop talking, I'll type in the chat the International Farm Transition Network. I do like to plug them. That's where I was certified as a succession coordinator, primarily for personal reasons. Like I was like, I need to learn more about how to do this within my own family. And I assume my family's not the only family in this country that needs help with this. So it's now been one of the greatest joys in my own professional life, is to help other farms and ranches work through this, and as a facilitator. And why I'm going to post in the chat the website, because you can search for coordinators within your state or region. So you can reach out to folks specifically, because fair versus equal will look differently in different parts of the country. But generally, like I said before, what's the division symbol equal, like meaning? Is it, you're dividing it equally by the heirs, or are you dividing it unequally that might be more fair for who has created, if you are dividing more fairly due to the different roles and responsibilities that different heirs or successors have had on the farm. So I'll type some kind of next steps or links that you can go to for further resources. But I'd also, and I'd love to hear if Jerry has anything else to add, because it is such a dense topic that is kind of beautifully combines all the things in terms of the family dynamics versus the legal statutes that might create some really surprising and complications. So Jerry, do you have anything to add that I haven't really broadly touched on fair versus equal?
Nothing specific, other than to just say your story is, typical in some respects, but as you point out, they're all different. But I would have to say that fair versus equal in families where there are more than one successor potentially or heir, to me, is one of the most challenging issues there is. And I've seen a number of parents who, senior generation, who punt, and with disastrous results. I noted one of the questions involved multiple siblings. That's a challenge, and parents who don't address it are really setting up the next generation for a challenge. So it is one of the most difficult issues, and there's no formula, and but it really needs to be put on the table sooner than later, in the hopes of getting a reasonable consensus. And my bias is that fair is usually not equal. And I think folks really need to recognize that up front. Again, it's, there's no judgment. Families do what they think is right for them, but it's a challenging issue. And I think very helpful to hear you walk through it from the first hand, Susanna. So appreciate that. And Caitlin, I'm just curious, I can try to run through some of the questions or the chat. I know we've have 6 minutes of time as I recollection, and Zoom is merciless and will cut us off mid-sentence. So I don't
Yeah.
know what.
Yeah, well, and I just wanted to note too, we'll share some resources. So, some of the links in the chat, you don't have to be super worried about grabbing those. So we'll do some follow-up on through the NFU team to provide you all some resources that both Jerry and Susanna and I have mentioned. But I guess in terms of the Q&A, just a couple that I wanted to flag for you, Jerry. So and you talked a little bit about LLCs earlier, but someone was curious about whether an LLC is a tool for transferring land and machinery to family members. I just wonder, I know you can touch on this a little bit, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about the LLC tool and how it's used.
Yes, the short answer is yes. It's a very flexible tool. And I think, a good way to transfer all sorts of assets that are going to potentially have multiple owners. So I encourage, you have to sort of be realistic in that you don't want to create a dozen LLCs if you're not going to maintain them as separate entities. But if you've got the capacity and the patience to create and then maintain the entities as separate, and with all that entails in terms of administration and bookkeeping and tax accounting, it's a good way to, separate the assets and allow for multiple ownership that may shift over time.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So I know that this is one that we always get with succession planning that we try to kind of lob to the experts, but wondering, Jerry, if you can touch on a little bit of the tax ramifications open question that many folks have. So someone was wondering about in terms of the gift restrictions. So what are some of the tax ramifications involved in gifts?
Well, so there's two elements to that. I mean, frankly, gifting, given the current federal estate and gift tax exemptions, there's no tax consequence for the gift itself. I mean, the exemptions right now are like 11.8 million per person. So if you're over that exemption level, good for you. You've got a sort of a tax planning problem for an estate tax or gift, and they're treated the same tax-wise. In terms of conservation easements and how an easement might affect a transfer, the reality is that whether you convey a conservation easement during your lifetime or at death, I mean, it will, again, reduce the value of the asset, which, depending on your sort of asset level bracket, could potentially reduce, gift or estate taxes. Again, not all states have gift taxes. Many do, but again, the main sort of tax that comes into play is the federal combined gift and estate tax, and the exemption levels are very high, though that may change.
And this should be a quick one, but Philip was asking, how hard is it to change land from conservation back to non-ag down the road? And we mentioned this term of perpetuity, right? But I wonder if, Jerry, maybe you can talk a little bit about that and reiterate that piece.
It's a great question. And in my view, if the easement is properly drafted, it should be almost impossible. So I think it's important, and it's a good question because it emphasizes the significance of conveying a permanent conservation easement on your property. Emphasis on permanent/perpetuity. These are designed to be irrevocable, unchangeable. I mean, there are some very difficult legal standards to meet to terminate an easement, but most easements are designed and intended to be as difficult as possible to terminate. So it needs a lot of careful thought before you convey a conservation easement on your land.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah. So we have just 1 minute left, and I want to kind of maybe combine two questions around, kind of the purchase of family land. So someone was asking about grants that might help with that process, and others asking just about in the situation where there isn't a family heir and it's kind of overwhelming, what are some of the places to start? And I wonder if, either of you could talk a little bit about some of the financing options as some of the things to be thinking about in this process. I know grants may play a role depending on the tools that you're using at your disposal, like in the case of a conservation easement. But yeah, just wondering if you can talk a little bit about the financing aspect.
Well, I mean, just quickly, so, one great tool is if you have a program, is the sale of a conservation easement that can generate proceeds that can help address that issue. Otherwise, I mean, grants for outright purchase are rare. And so you're likely looking at financing. And so, the usual suspects are going to be the Farm Service Agency, which can be quite cumbersome, but has, attractive interest rates, the Farm Credit System, again, which has programs for beginning farmers, but, it's not free money. Interest rates are low. And then, in some areas, commercial banks will also make farm loans, perhaps with some accommodation for younger beginning farmers. But again, I think policy-wise, that's an area where we probably need some new programming and additional funds to really make that happen.
Great. Well, we're at time, so just want to thank everyone for joining today, and open invitation to follow up with us. And thank you to NFU for hosting.
Yes.
Certainly. Thank you, Caitlin, Jerry, and Susanna. That was really great. And I know there are a lot of questions pouring in, and really appreciated your time and insight shared with all of us. So thanks for that. And of course, we'll work with you to try to get back in touch with anybody who submitted questions that didn't come up. Also, if you found this really, really interesting and want to share it with others, or want to check back for your own reference, the sessions will be available on our convention website. And just some reminders for everybody. Next week on February 18th at 2 p.m., we'll be hosting another webinar entitled "Come Let Us Reason Together, Stories of Farmers Union Conventions." It's a historical look at some of our past gatherings. And then at 3:30 p.m. Eastern on the 18th, we'll hold a session on opportunities for climate-focused economic development in rural America. So both of those ought to be pretty thought-provoking. I hope you can join us then. And as a reminder, because you all registered for this webinar, you're automatically registered for the next 2 weeks of convention webinars. So on the 18th and on Friday the 26th, you can stay up to date on our convention webinars and topics on our website. And of course, again, if you're not a member of Farmers Union, but you'd like to be, or you'd like to get more involved, I encourage you to head over to www.nfu.org/join. So once again, thanks to our panelists, and thanks to all of you for joining in. Have a good rest of your day.